welcome to the Courtney Turner Podcast. My guest today is Mark Gober. We have had several phenomenal conversations in the past, and it is always a treat to have a conversation with him. So I am looking forward to today. I'm sure it'll be no exception. And he's a very prolific author. He is now on his, I don't know, is this the fifth or the sixth book? I have lost count, but we are going to discuss an end to the upside down cosmos and whatever else comes up, because I'm sure there will be lots of other things that come up. So how are you doing today, Mark?
I'm great, Courtney. Thank you so much for having me on.
Likewise. Thank you for being here. So I have to ask, what I never know what the next topic is going to be and what guides you. Like what made you decide to write this?
I mean, the last time we talked, I wasn't planning on this book. So this is the seventh in the series. We talked last time about my book, An End to Upside Down Medicine. Cosmology really was not on my radar, but I was thinking about this before we got on the call. I could tie this book to you because you introduced me to Alex Zeck a few years ago. Yeah. And then we met at your conference, Rebels for a Cause in Franklin, Tennessee. And then Alec invited me to be on his series called The End of COVID, available at theendofcovid.com, questioning germ theory, what's the truth with viruses and all that stuff, which was new to me. And that led me to write my book, An End to Upside Down Medicine. So then I went to the Austin area to do an interview on Alec's show, The Way Forward. This was end of 2023. And he said, Mark, you really need to come to my conference in Texas. It's called Confluence. It's April 2024. You just have to come. So I said, okay, I'll come. I didn't know much about it. He said, I want you to talk about medicine. So I was there at this conference, and a lot of people were talking about cosmology. And what I found was that many of the people who were asking questions about germ theory, including very intelligent people, some doctors, other just like people that I respect, were saying that the logical fallacies that we find in medicine, where people are jumping to conclusions about causes when they're actually inferences, the same thing is applied to cosmology, meaning what is Earth? What's our place in the cosmos? So I heard that and was a little bit, I wasn't sure I was going to be diving into this. And this was also around the time of the launch of Stephen A. Young's book called A Fool's Wisdom. He's a theoretical physics PhD, highly credentialed physicist. And his book talks not only about cosmology, but other things. But I went to the cosmology chapters, and he said things like the following, and this is almost a direct quote. He said, after researching this and trying to debunk all of what I was hearing, I am not 100% certain what this place is, but I'm 100% certain what it's not, and it's not a spinning globe. And he gave pieces of evidence. And I just remember thinking, this is interesting. Like, that is some wild stuff from a physicist. And I was hearing other people kind of murmur about this too. And then I had some people actually encourage me to explore it, because there's a lot of polarization around these cosmological topics, which is actually somewhat curious. Like, I can understand why the medical topics are very polarizing, like vaccines and everything like that, because you're dealing with someone's health, and it could be life or death if you have a wrong opinion. This other stuff is really not as material to everyday living. I think it's very important for reasons we'll discuss. So that was curious to me. And I ended up looking into it. Also received some resources from Kelly Brogan, who's a medical doctor and has been speaking out about many topics, but this is something she's looked into. And I was on her podcast, Reclamation Radio, talking about it. And the resources that she sent over didn't like shift my perspectives on the spot, but at least gave a lay of the land of what the sorts of arguments were. And then the deeper I went into it, I tried to do what many people have done that I've looked at in the past, where they try to say, how can I directly prove the current cosmology? And they are unable to do so. And they actually find evidence that contradicts the model. So let me do two things before I pause here. Number one is this important principle that when you falsify a model, it's not necessary to come up with a replacement to say, well, I know what it is instead. And that can leave us in a place of saying, well, I know it's not this, but I don't know what it is. The analogy I give in my book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, it's as if we're taking a multiple choice test, and the two of us, Courtney, are having to decide whether the correct answer on a multiple choice question is A, B, C, or D. And I spend a week looking at it, and you spend a week looking at it, and you come to me and you think that it's A, and that's the answer that you want us to submit to the teacher. And I say, I hear what you're saying, Courtney, but I have actually found all these reasons to falsify A. And then you actually agree with me, but you say, Mark, is it B, C, or D? And I respond to you, I'm not sure, because we need to do a lot more analysis to figure out what the correct answer is. And then you would say irrationally, well, if we don't know if it's B, C, or D, then we're going with A. That is actually not rational. It's possible to say, I don't know the answer. That's point number one. And point number two is I want to lay out what the current cosmological model is, generally speaking, because this discussion, I think, is often misbranded as flat Earth versus round Earth.
Right.
And that's really, it's a way bigger discussion. The discussion is, where do we live? What's our place in the cosmos? And we're basically told 13.8 billion years ago in some unimaginably far away place at a time that's unimaginably long ago. We know that there was an event called the Big Bang, and it filled the universe with matter. And after billions of years, it led to galaxies and solar systems like the one that we're in, where we end up on a rock revolving around this gaseous thing in the middle called a sun. And Earth is doing so, revolving actually in a state of free fall around the sun at over 60,000 miles per hour, while revolving around the Milky Way galaxy at over 500,000 miles an hour, while part of an expanding universe at over 1 million miles an hour, and rotating on a tilted axis at about 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, which is faster than the speed of sound, on a spherically shaped object. That's basically the modern cosmology. And what I've tried to do in the book is to look at, well, can we directly verify those things? And what I'm finding is that it's easy for us to jump into inferences, especially when we're dealing with the ultra small or the ultra big, because the way that we observe is much more difficult. So we end up observing things and then fitting them into a model, and then the model almost becomes like a religion, a dogma. And so that's what I try to do in this book. I don't claim to know what's true, but there are many anomalies that should make us be questioning. It should make us question, where do we live and why haven't we been taught these things?
Yes. So one thing I will just touch on there, because there's so much there, but this idea of the Big Bang narrative. So I have recently, well, not that long, I guess like a year ago, I went to CERN. And when you go into CERN, like there was a presentation and they talk about the Big Bang Theory, and they say, well, the Big Bang Theory isn't quite right. And then they double down. They say, well, there are actually 4 Big Bangs. And they say, we've learned there's a, different theory, and there's actually 4 Big Bangs. And so we need to rewrite the story of the universe, is what they say. And so that we can understand our place in it. And I found this very interesting because I had literally just finished reading, I think it's a 157-page book. You can find it at officeforthefuture.com. It's called First Values and First Principles of Evolving Perennialism, something on cosmoerotic humanism. And the pen name is David Temple. I still haven't figured out why it's David Temple, because they tell you the author's names. So it's Ken Wilber, it's Zach Stein, and Mark Gaffney. And they've written this manifesto on cosmoerotic humanism. But they talk about how we have to go from Homo sapiens to Homo universalis, and that we need to rewrite the story of the universe so that we can understand our place in it. And when I heard it at CERN, it's like, this is really interesting. I'm seeing a, theme, like this is popping up. And I think it's really important because I think that I think we should definitely be asking. I agree with you. I think the questions, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on why we should, what was it? 42 propositions on cosmoerotic humanism is what it was. First principles and first values. Yeah. So I do think it's important to ask the question, but I think there's a lot invested in the narrative. I think the narrative is, I think there are people who have a lot invested in the narrative and steering us towards a very specific narrative about the universe, about our place in it particularly. And also this idea of rewriting the story, because that's very interesting wording, right? It's not uncovering, it's not revealing, discovering, it's not investigating, it's rewriting the story. And I hear that theme a lot too. That's I heard the cosmoerotic humanists are saying this, now CERN saying this. I hear the same thing from ARC, right? The Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. They keep saying we need a better story. We need a new narrative. And so, I've heard it many other places too, but it's a theme, and that's really not the same thing as let's ask questions, let's discover, let's uncover, So So,
Well, I think that this notion of a story and a narrative, it's very significant because it doubles down on the fact that the current idea we're told about cosmology is a story and a narrative.
right.
It's taking bits and pieces of observations and coming up with the story of 13.8 billion years, which has rippling effects of Darwinism, because you need billions of years. That's a very specific type of an evolutionary theory.
Yep.
And everything that goes with it. And then that leads into geology. So many disciplines are based on this 13.8 billion years
Yep.
and gravity and relativity working a very specific way. So my approach to this is really not, it's not as much narrative based. It's like, well, where are we? I mean, I started off on my journey in 2016. If your audience isn't familiar, I used to work in investment banking in New York. I graduated from Princeton in 2008. So I was doing investment banking during the financial crisis. Then I worked in Boston and Silicon Valley, became a partner at a technology strategy firm. So I wasn't interested in like what we're talking about today. And I've had this major shift. But it started with like, what's the nature of consciousness? Is there an afterlife? Is there a soul? Or is that all just superstition? Because I used to be more of an atheist, agnostic person. And then I realized there's some science to challenge the materialist view. And maybe there is meaning built into the nature of reality, and that spiritual and religious traditions have been speaking about an actual truth that we've gotten away from. So that was part of my initial orientation. So I was asking the question, well, then who am I and why am I here?
Yeah.
But I sort of presupposed what here was as this narrative of Big Bang and everything we discussed. And what I realized when I started looking into this book of what is the nature of the cosmos is, what does it mean to be here? Where are we? Because really the current narrative paints a very bleak picture of we are in this sort of dead random universe on one little speck. And it's this near infinite vacuum. It's so big we can't even imagine it. And we're just this little insignificant thing. And it's actually a principle known as the Copernican principle. There's a good documentary on this by Robert Stinjanis. It's on YouTube now. And the Copernican principle is, the Copernican revolution was the idea that Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. Heliocentrism, sun-centric rather than geocentrism, Earth-centric. Most of us don't even think about that anymore because it's so ingrained in society. Of course, Earth revolves around the sun. Sun's at the center of the solar system. But there's a philosophical bias toward that to say that, oh, Earth, we're not special. I mean, Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist, he said, we believe this on principles of modesty. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting how philosophy gets embedded into science, but isn't science supposed to be science? And this is important because when new observations come, the philosophy will guide how people interpret those observations. And there's a logical fallacy, which I talked about in the medicine book, and I find myself talking about it all the time. It's called affirming the consequent. Mm-hmm. And the technical way of describing it is, if X, then Y, Y, therefore X. And to simplify that a lot, it goes like this. If it rains, then the grass will be wet. True statement, no problem there. Mm-hmm. Second statement's a problem. I observe that the grass is wet, therefore it rained. Mm. Why is that a problem? Because there are many other reasons that there could be wet grass.
Right.
It could be sprinkler systems. It could be dew. It could be some phenomenon of science that we don't understand. Mm-hmm. There are many reasons that wet grass could be wet. So another way of generalizing this is we are prone often to jump to a causal model just because a model can adequately explain a phenomenon. But just because a model can adequately explain a phenomenon doesn't mean the model's correct. Right. So it's true that there are elements of our current cosmology that can explain certain things, but that doesn't mean it's the correct model. There might be other models that can also explain those things. So what's happened is we observe the wet grass and we say, oh, it rained. And then we build entire industries and academic departments and prizes around the fact that it rained, and we don't fund the other hypotheses. And then we say, of course it rained. If you ask any other questions, then you're a hypocrite and you're a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, that pretty much sums that up. That's an interesting point that you bring up, the philosophy being embedded in science. So I feel like we do have, science has really become so far removed from what science actually is. Science is a method. It's a process of discovering and finding evidence, and then, basically that nothing can actually be proven, right? It's what did Richard Feynman say? Like, there are many answers that cannot be, there are many questions that cannot be answered, but there are no answers that cannot be questioned. And that's kind of, I feel like that sums up science, right? We're constantly trying to prove things, and then evidence comes forth, and it's upheld until new evidence comes forth that either confirms it or, debunks it. But I think that what we've moved towards is, I call it like a scientism. I think we've talked about this before, but it becomes a religion. It's a replacing of a worldview. So everybody has to believe in something, even people who say they're atheists, they're still putting their faith in something, because humans, as human capacity, can't know everything. But in order to just function, we therefore have to put our faith in something. Because sometimes you just have to take steps, right? You have to do things, and you don't have all the answers in front of you because we can't know everything. So we put faith in something, and science has now been kind of constructed in a way where people can put their faith in it. But embedded in that are these various philosophies and worldviews. And as you said, then it gets built upon that. And that's kind of really what I was seeing with this whole, we have to build a new story about the universe and our place in it. And from that, we go from Homo sapiens to Homo universalis, which, you can kind of see all the various thinkers that are embedded in that, right? I mean, it's like H.G. Wells just jumping out at me, but yeah. So I think that's very interesting. I think it's really important for people to recognize that, because the more I look into science, the more I feel like there's so few, or I shouldn't say there's so few. I should say that what I'm recognizing is a lot of these people have been propped up. A lot of people, right? Their discovery, and a lot of them don't even deserve credit for their discovery. How many, Nobel, like the Watson and Crick, I think is a great example. They later admitted, right? Like, oh yeah, we should have given the credit, but we didn't. And so, yeah. So I think that's
you're making an important observation that I've observed too, that this is a science-wide phenomenon where certain ideas and certain people are propped up, and then that becomes the standard. And if you ask questions, you get called crazy names, pseudoscientists. I first saw this with the science of consciousness on quote unquote paranormal phenomena, which I don't think are paranormal. They're just part of a broadened physics. If we understood reality differently, those scientists who study those phenomena, they get called horrible names, or their Wikipedia pages are branded. But we see that everywhere. Right. And so the question becomes, and I know you spend so much time on this, what is the social engineering around all of that, and who and why and what is going on to make these ideas the predominant ones that we're taught in school? And it gets to the point where the indoctrination is strong enough where we have a visceral negative reaction to anyone asking the question. Mm-hmm. And another thing I'm finding very often is the reliance on inference. And I can understand why inference is important when we're trying to understand truth, but there's almost this acceptance of, well, we don't need any direct evidence of something. So let's just bring it to virology for a second, or germ theory. Yeah. We've never seen an alleged virus get inside of a host cell, infect it, replicate, go to other cells, cause disease in the host, and then jump to another person and cause the same disease. We've never seen any of that, and yet the entire world was shut down on the basis of the belief that happens. Yeah. What do we have instead? We have a bunch of indirect evidence. It doesn't mean it's wrong. I do think it probably is, but it doesn't on its face mean it's wrong. We have just a plethora of indirect evidence. We have unpurified samples, and we assume a virus is in it. We take a static picture of it. We don't see anything moving. We see a dead thing, and we say, well, that must have been the virus. Right. When we might be confusing that thing for many other possible structures. That's just one example. And the same thing goes for everything in cosmology, especially when we're dealing with these cosmic scales. And then I want to go to your point about the potential of social engineering, because I wasn't expecting it in cosmology, and I'm like, oh, here it is again. And not with the people I was expecting. So I was shocked to learn that people like Einstein and Stephen Hawking and Fred Hoyle, like very credible physicists, they've all made the same statements, which is that when we observe things in the sky above us, we actually can't tell whether Earth is at the center or if the sun's at the center. Mm-hmm. It's known as a kinematic equivalence. But because of this philosophical preference toward sun-centered, heliocentric, we've come to that model. Yeah. That's super interesting. Now, let's go back even further, because a lot of the beliefs about motion come from Newton. Yes. And gravity, and the idea that an apple falls to the ground because of a force called gravity. I haven't come across anyone who denies that an apple falls to the ground. The question is why? Is it because of this mystical force that mass has in it somehow, that it pulls it down? Or is there another reason that it happens? So I didn't realize that there are holes in Newton's theory. So if a theory is comprehensive and correct, it will be able to explain all phenomena. It's like the way I describe it in my book is, if we have a law that says all swans are white and we find 1 million white swans, and then there's a single black swan, the law has been violated because the law says all swans are white. So that means we need a new model. I know this sounds basic, but we don't, somehow it's like, well, that's just a little anomaly. We can forget about it. But when it comes to Newton's gravity, there's the big one, which is that Newton's gravity cannot explain Mercury's motion around the sun in the sky. There's something wrong with gravity. So what came along next was Einstein's relativity theory, which allegedly compensated for it. But Einstein's relativity theory has run into a number of problems. One that comes to mind is that there's a special relativity theory, which is a subset of the general relativity theory, and there are incompatibilities, which is impossible if one is a subset of the other. And there's a physicist named Robert Bennett, PhD, who wrote his thesis on relativity. He comes from a lineage where I believe it was his thesis advisor's mentor worked directly with Einstein, something like that. So this is someone who came from the Einsteinian lineage. And he says, look, the way that special relativity and general relativity, the way they treat light and ether, they're different. So they're not even compatible.
Yeah.
But then if we take it a step further, in 1933, there was an observation by an astronomer named Fritz Zwicky. He observed the Coma cluster of galaxies, and basically the way things were moving did not conform to Einstein's relativity, which is the revised gravity, because there wasn't enough mass there. The math was off by like 99%.
Wow.
So he could have said, we need to rethink all of gravity.
Right.
Or maybe there's just something we don't see, and we're going to call it dark matter. So he discovered dark matter,
Okay.
quote unquote.
Right.
And now you can see the house of cards developing, and now my social engineering mind is, and I'm sure yours is going off of what's happening here, because there are now physicists led by Pavel Krupa of the University of Bonn in Germany. You can look at his Wikipedia page, it's like credible dude,
right.
Astrophysicist. He's saying we've been looking at the predictions of dark matter that's allegedly there, and we falsified it by more than 5 sigma confidence. That means 99.99+% falsification, which means there's something wrong with relativity and gravity. And if we go back even further to stick with this social engineering thought, and going back to the notion of geocentrism versus heliocentrism, there was a man named Tycho Brahe, who maybe your audience, I remember hearing about him in high school.
Okay.
Like he had this geocentric model, Earth is at the center,
Right.
and his associate was Johannes Kepler.
Oh, yeah.
And Kepler, so Kepler was famous in bringing about what we now know as the heliocentric model.
Right.
What I didn't realize was that Kepler basically took Brahe's papers and all of his data and moved from geocentrism to heliocentrism. And there's a whole book written theorizing that Kepler killed Tycho Brahe. Whoa. And then we've been led to this Copernican, Kepler, Newton, sun at the center type model. And it makes me ask the question, and some people have said, is there something here with all these characters that there's been an intentional desire to put us in a certain model? And I want to say one more about Einstein, because now I have a lot of questions about Einstein. Why was he propped up as, right, as this paragon of like, he's the classic scientist? There was another famous study in 1887 called Michelson-Morley that really shifted all of science to an extent that I didn't realize. And without getting into details of the study, they were looking at light beams. Mm-hmm. And they found a null result, and the null result in their mind said that there is no ether. And ether is significant because this was the fifth element in ancient times, and it was basically taken out because of this alleged null result. But there are people who've looked at this more closely and said, actually, that study has been completely misinterpreted. Where there was a fringe shift, and Robert Bennett, the PhD I mentioned, he actually said there was this slight result. And there was a presupposition in that study that Earth is in motion around the sun. So they presupposed Earth moves, therefore what we observe tells us that there's no ether, and ether was moved out, whereas we could have said Earth is stationary and there is an ether. But obviously we went toward Earth moves and there's no ether. And Einstein's relativity came in on the heels of this. He said this in one of his talks. I quote him saying how important this study was to him. And basically one of the ideas from Einstein was, well, the measuring device probably shrank. And that's why we got the result we got. And that's what relativity is. When you're moving really fast, time dilates and space contracts. This is all Einstein's relativity. Right. So I'm hopefully giving you a bunch of these points where we've been led to a whole cosmology that could have gone in another direction, where there were these key figures every time who steered us in a certain way. And now if you ask these questions about heliocentrism or anything else, you get called crazy. But when you look at the history, it's a different story. And it's the same thing with germ theory and virology. When you look at the history, actually you can see that maybe we've been misled.
Yeah. Well, Einstein is a very interesting character. So there's like no footage or evidence of him like teaching, lecturing, which is very strange. I mean, there are many others of his peers, so it's not the time frame, but there's no evidence. And you would think if he's this grand professor, wouldn't there be all sorts of like at least pictures somewhere? Or but there isn't. There's just stories. I interviewed someone last night who said that he knew someone who knew Einstein and said that he didn't believe at all that he was, the great scientist that they claimed. But I mean, that's just purely anecdotal. Somebody's, but yeah, it does seem like, and everything about him is very over dramatized, right? Like the crazy hair and the expression on his face. It's always very like narrative driven is what it feels like. I mean, I don't know. But it does feel like they've crafted a whole persona around this person that there's no evidence of actually, giving these lectures. So I've always found that curious. That's not to say that proves anything, but it's just curious to me. But yeah. Yeah. What were you going to say?
Another figure, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, Courtney, is Galileo, because I had always heard of Galileo as this propped up figure. He got us away from ancient beliefs about Earth at the center because he looked in his telescope and he showed otherwise. Right. But I had never looked into what did he actually see in his telescope and what did he prove? And why were we led in a certain direction? So there were two key things that I talk about in my book. He observed the phases of Venus, which are sort of like the phases of the moon.
Right.
And he said that makes sense if Earth revolves around the sun. We can explain that. The problem is we can also explain that with the geocentric model where the planets, i.e. the wandering stars, that's what a planet is, they revolve around the sun while the sun moves around Earth. So either one could work. He didn't prove heliocentrism. He just showed that it could work with heliocentrism. And likewise, he saw Jupiter and its moons, and he saw smaller bodies revolving around bigger bodies, and it concluded, well, Earth is a smaller body revolving around the sun, which is, of course, one possibility. But to say that looking at the ceiling tells us about the floor, it's actually illogical to make these conclusions. And then the way Galileo was treated, he wasn't persecuted in the way that I had heard. I found some very contrarian narratives where he was kind of on house arrest in a very lavish place in Florence. So, like, what was there a psyop involved here where we've been told a false story? I'm curious your thoughts.
Well, it sounds like it. I don't know. I mean, I haven't really done like a deep dive on Galileo since maybe third grade. But I remember,
Me too.
Right? Yeah, I think Indigo Girls did a song on him, right? I can't sing, but Galileo's head was on the block. The crime was looking up the truth. Yeah, I'm not going to try to sing, but yeah, there was a whole song about him, like very much. They made him out to sound like Socrates, right? Like he was persecuted wrongly, and he's like the icon for that. Yeah, so I don't know. I really don't have enough of an answer because I'd have to investigate more. But he definitely was created as like an icon of somebody wrongly persecuted. So, and that the question would be, well, why wrong? Yeah, here it is. The crime was looking up the truth, and as the bombshells of my daily fears explode, I try to trace them to my youth. And then you bring up reincarnation over a couple of years the other night, and now I'm serving time for mistakes made by another in another lifetime. Anyway, you can look it up. But so I remember at that time I did look into him a bit, but I mean, I didn't know like anything that I know now. So yeah, I don't know, but it does feel like there's a lot invested in creating these, certain iconic figures and steering the narrative in a very specific way. And when you talk about the heliocentric versus an Earth-centric model, I can think that has a huge impact on humans, how we see ourselves in the world. It has a huge impact also on religious models. Right. So if you believe that we are here by nature of a benevolent, divine creator, and that we are here we were endowed with free will but he's hoping that we do his will, then that through free will, we have a potential for virtue and morality that will align with his will. That's actually not a very small role at all. That makes humans quite important. That makes Earth quite important. And if you're familiar with the biblical story, then, the whole notion of, what was created and, the whole design, just the intelligent design, which I think that even people who are not not religious or don't subscribe to maybe, traditional biblical framework, recognize. That's why there's the Gaia religions, right? Because they recognize there's something so special about Mother Nature, as they would call it. But when you start making it about the sun being the center, and again, I don't know which one is, but when you, just speaking from a narrative perspective, when you make it that, then we're now worshiping the sun, essentially. And isn't that what the ancient mystery cults, the sun god?
There's a documentary called Heliosorcery that makes that very case, that the psyop with Newton, Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, everyone in that lineage was around sun worship. And so how that worked, I don't exactly know, but we hear from people like Edwin Hubble, who is famous for having come up with the expanding universe theory, which basically is part of this Big Bang notion. Right. And some of the quotes I have from him in my book are pretty incredible, where he said it would be a horror if Earth had a central place. It would be an most unwelcome proposition. Very strong language, which led him to force fit his observations basically into an expanding universe, where it's like if you're blowing up a balloon, each dot, if you were to draw dots on a balloon, would expand in a certain way, because they didn't want to have Earth to be at the center. That would be like Stephen Hawking said, on principles of modesty, we don't want to believe that. But I completely agree with you, Courtney, that this takes us away from any degree of real significance and the religious and spiritual implications. Because if we get into something that resembles geocentrism, then you automatically have to start thinking about, well, why are we in a central place? Is there a creator? And that invokes all kinds of belief systems that mainstream science does not want us to think about.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I didn't even know that there was a theory around that. That's interesting that I deduced that, right?
You did.
That's really funny. But yeah, that's where my head goes. I mean, I am very familiar with the ancient mystery cults and the sun worship, the sun god, the ancient Egypt. But yeah, that's kind of, it seems like it was to corroborate that, which in many ways would indicate, if that's true. And again, I don't know, I'm not privy.
Me neither.
But right. But if that's true, it would almost indicate that they knew that that's false, and that their worship was some sort of a means of selling a lie for control. And that's the big thing they don't want revealed. So.
Exactly. And we see this everywhere. So to me, cosmology, it fits the pattern. And that's probably why it took me a while to even open up enough to look into this, because it took like psyop after psyop and seeing how clear it works. And the same pattern fits here. And then we end up with, I mentioned dark matter, dark energy is another one. So if you believe mainstream cosmology, you have to plug in 96% of the universe and say, well, yeah, that stuff's there in order to prop up the whole model. Or even the Big Bang. There's this rapid expansion that allegedly happened. I don't know how they would claim that they know that happened so long ago. Right. But in order for that rapid expansion, you need a particle called an inflaton particle, which has never even been established. So they're propping up these models to continue a belief system. Like, why would that be done?
Well, so interesting. I know he pulled up the New Thought leaders. Do you know who Barbara Marx Hubbard is?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So she's kind of like the grandmother to the cosmoerotic humanists. So they actually, Mark Gaffney, or I think it was Mark Gaffney, who talks about how it was a co-creation, that term. It was a synergistic experience, and they, had that, they both co-created it, even though they weren't, they didn't know the other person did. It was like a telepathic experience. And I'm not saying they couldn't, but it was, a very melodramatic explanation of how this occurred. But so much of their narrative is predicated on this like infinite cosmos kind of story. And what it does is when you're talking about, so there's like it's twofold, right? So the notion that if we're not the center, then it, diminishes our significance. But then there's also, if we are not the center, then the people who could possibly aspire and, ascend to have some sort of spiritual elevation, that they have some sort of gnosis, that they could ascend and they essentially could become the god. So they could become more than significant, right? And it allows for that possibility. If you have this notion of this infinite universe that's constantly expanding, and that certain people could, they believe in spiritual evolution, right? The cosmic evolution. But only for certain people. The rest get like evolve or die. The rest to get subsumed back into, and then they believe in like a reincarnation type of process. But this narrative does lend itself to them achieving power.
Yeah, it relies on a certain cosmology.
Yeah.
And I think what you're alluding to is something that I've started to call the spiritual left. Do you know what I mean when I say that?
I
It's like believing in something that's post-materialist. Materialist meaning it's all matter, it's all random and meaningless, and that's where I used to be. And some of the spiritual stuff that they talk about, I would agree with because I think there's scientific validation. But the way they twist the implications is where I think you and I probably differ from them. And often the climate narrative is embedded within that, which is we're evolving in this way, and therefore we should restrict human behavior because of human-caused climate change. And it's an existential threat, and this gets us into the Great Reset and those sorts of things.
Yep. I think that's exactly right. That's an interesting way of putting it, the spiritual left. So the way I look at, especially, well, when you go and you look at like the ancient mystery cults, which I think, are still very much alive and well today, even though we call them ancient and mysterious, but I think they are very much, there are people who still subscribe to those views, whether they're directly aware of it or not. I think there are people who are. But if you look at it, there's kind of like this battle of the ones who are much more mystical, emotional, spiritually oriented, and they're what I would call the more maternal. So it's the feminine, and that tends to operate through the left. I typically look at things. I describe it as a Hegelian dialectic, and not to say that there aren't warring factions. I think there absolutely are, but I think a lot of times they will compete, knowing that they can advance a synthesis, which they can both achieve power, or they're hoping they can achieve power. And then you have what they're typically perceived as the right. And I think we're seeing this kind of in the United States right now. It's very much the right, but the right occultists, the quote unquote right, are more like the Templars, the Malta. They tend to be more authoritarian, disciplinarian, materialistic, and the kind of paternalistic, right? That's the archetype of paternal, masculine dominant. And I typically do think of those as being or at least they operate through the right. So it's interesting that you call it the spiritual left. But what I'm seeing right now play out is, and it does look like whether it's an intentional dialectic or not, I think it's leading us towards the same place, and I'm actually very concerned about it. So I've been diving into something called Game B. Are you familiar with Game B?
No.
Okay. So I've been diving into Game B, and Game B actually did have a split, and it was like exactly this, that there were the people who Jim Rutt, who's kind of like the grandfather, described as being more woo-woo and a little too spiritually oriented. And he's a hard scientist, like a literal scientist. And so he, there was a bit of a schism in it, but ultimately and a lot of them are more, they describe things as, they say they're not in favor of transhumanism, that the transhumanists are crazy, that they don't want a top-down authoritarian type of technocracy. Yet everything they're describing seems to be leading in that direction, but they're doing it from an angle of collective spiritualism, which is very much what I think you would describe as leftist spiritualism. But then you have the other side, which we're seeing very much, I think, in unfortunately the like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel type of technocracy, which is much more authoritative type of we're going to come in and clean things up and be efficient, and it has that masculine type of energy, and although they're not couching it in being top-down authoritative, I think they're going to offer you the label of decentralization, which won't really end up being decentralized, unfortunately. But so all that to say, that's a great way to describe it. Yeah, I definitely see that.
Wow, yeah, it's fascinating, and I like your the dichotomy of the masculine, feminine, because in my book, An End to the Upside Down Reset, I devoted a lot of that book to psychoanalyzing the left. Yeah. And in political psychology, it's known that liberals, generally speaking, tend to value compassion as a bigger percentage of their overall moral compass. And not that it's a bad thing, but it can be weaponized, where they think something's compassionate, but they don't have the discernment to see that it's not actually compassionate, or they're not taking the time to discern. So it's like compassion with discernment's necessary, whereas blind compassion, which is what I think we see from the left, is the big concern. And then on the other side of it is we have this overly masculine perspective where it's just we're going to dig in and not have any compassion. That's not a good thing either. So I think that's also what you're seeing, that both sides can be highly toxic.
Yeah, absolutely. And both sides can be weaponized for sure.
Yeah.
But interesting that I would agree that compassion is very much aligned with the feminine, because when you think about like compassion, not that men don't have compassion, obviously they do. Sure. We would hope most do, but typically you think of it as being a feminine trait, and the reason for that is biological, because they need to be in tune with their infants, so they need to be compassionate to their infants and know, when they're suffering, so they can alleviate that suffering. However, because it's really, it's built on empathy, and the whole history of compassion is actually really interesting. Like the term empathy in the English language is actually pretty new. It's like Victor Asher, and it came from aesthetics. It was this idea, and it actually originally came from a German term, which I'm not going to even attempt to say because I'll butcher it. But the German term actually means feeling into, and it was a very almost like Alfhaven, where it's an oxymoronic term. It's like feeling into and into feeling simultaneously. But it was used traditionally in terms of like art and aesthetics. Like you could feel into a painting and, I guess, into feeling, both simultaneously. But it was used in that context. It wasn't used as much in terms of like people and situations. And compassion is built on top of that, although the actual history, the origins of compassion have religious connotation. So this merging of empathy being, the first layer of compassion, because typically in modern vernacular, we think of compassion as being empathy, where you can relate to somebody else's suffering, but now you also built on top of that, you want to alleviate it, you want to remove that suffering. And when you think about it in terms of biologically for women, yes, they want to be compassionate to be in tune with their offspring. However, what happens if there's a threat to their offspring? They're not like warm, fuzzy. They're vicious mama bears. They're going to protect their offspring. And I think that's what they're weaponizing. They're weaponizing that, especially because we have this intersectional politics and all these, identity groups. So now you have these, you could call like these leaders and the mama bears in each group. And now they're going to stand up and when they feel that group is being protected, and that's where their compassion is being weaponized. So it's not that they're warm, fuzzy to everything. It's that they're protecting that group, whatever label, has been, inscribed onto them. But yeah, so I think that does kind of fit with the, maternal and masculine. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think what we're also doing here is broadening the aperture for the nature of the psyop and the social engineering, because it does start with the cosmology and then it gets down to the micro level of these political intersectional issues, and they're all interrelated. And I didn't realize the cosmological element of it until recently. Yeah.
No, I would absolutely agree. And so when you look at these people like Barbara Marx Hubbard, right? So they talk about how, and she has this spiral where she talks about how our crisis is our birth. And she says how we have, they all talk about this, how the crisis is like the opportunity. This is very much like the left talking, Saul Alinsky, right? Never let a crisis go to waste. But they talk about this too, that the crisis is our birth because it's the opportunity for co-creation. And so we can co-create with the universe, and we have this opportunity, all right, the homo amor. So it's this radical love affair with the whole universe, which is also like it's embedded in that cosmology. Because what if there's no interaction with the rest of the universe? What if everything we know about the universe is not correct and it's founded on false presuppositions? Then this radical love affair that's determining our place in it and how we co-create the super organism of humanity, which is what they're talking about, because otherwise we're going to go extinct. But it's all predicated on this, and it's really important because it's what they're driving, and really how they're driving the transhuman agenda. So even though they say they're not, right? They say that it's all about the spirituality and our consciousness is all connected already. But we see the people building technological singularity. So
Right.
yeah. So
Yeah, it's to me, all of these topics have so much nuance. Like technology, of course, is a good thing in that we can have this conversation and share it with so many people, but it's always about the weaponization. Compassion is a good and useful thing.
of
So
course.
it's like all of these different areas, they get weaponized, they get like hooked,
Yeah.
and people will just latch onto the good part and not see the negatives of it. I mean, I keep coming back to climate because I see that there perhaps more than anything. And
Well,
that seems to be an umbrella so much of this narrative of we have to do this. And it doesn't matter if we have to harm people or tax them. It's not actually bad to do that. We're not harming them. We're restricting their what they can eat or restricting their travel. It's all because we're going to save the planet and we're compassionate for doing it.
well, so the climate thing kills me because, first of all, we have literal quotes from the Club of Rome saying they lied, that it was all propaganda. So their 1972 limits to growth, is when they unleashed this whole narrative about the climate, crisis that we're up against, and predicated on a Malthusian lie, essentially. And then in
Mhm.
1992, their global revolution document says that we needed a common enemy because that basically nobody was going to rally behind this, junk science. Essentially, they didn't say that, obviously, but I don't remember the exact quote. But I actually have it in my my Hegel article, and I have the quote where they say like we needed a common enemy, and so of course they decide that the common enemy of humanity is man. Right. So, of course, it's our fault. We are the reason why the climate is changing. We're the reason for all the crises, the climate crises. So they flat out admitted that it was a lie and that it was a propaganda tactic. And so, I mean, that just right there, and the fact that people are still buying into this. But the other thing that's really interesting to watch is that you had in 2020, you had all these people. This has just been really stumping me because I find it so, like I see it so clearly. But you had all these people who decided they didn't want to take experimental drugs. And okay, that's fine. A lot of these people were traditionally anti-vaxxers, right? They didn't believe in vaccines at all. And a lot of them identified their label. They identified as being on the left. They voted historically Democratic, or or if they didn't, they saw themselves as being on the left. And then suddenly 2020 rolls around, and anybody who doesn't want to cover their face or get shots in their arm is suddenly on the right wing. They're a right winger. And all these, like, you saw so many of these people who were actually confused by it. They're like, I'm not, though. Like, suddenly now I'm a right winger. But a lot of people went along with it. They were like, oh, okay, I guess now I'm conservative. And not that they even knew what that meant. I'm not saying all of them, but, a lot of people were just like, okay, well, I guess I'm a conservative now, or I'm a Republican, or whatever label they decided to put on. But now you have a lot of these quote unquote Republicans or conservatives who historically were fighting against this climate lie, this whole, the Gaia religion is what I call it. But you had all these people who were fighting against it, and they would never buy an electric vehicle because they weren't going to buy into it, right? They weren't going to support this lie. And now that Elon is working under Trump, I can't tell you how many of them I've seen rush out and buy a Tesla, which is, and I'm like, okay, so just shifting the Overton window, and it's all done through these narratives and just like propping up a figure, right? It's some idol who wears a different label, and now everything changes and people's identity completely shifts.
It's like the Trump derangement syndrome, as it's called on the left, where basically it's almost like they believe no conspiracies exist unless it involves Donald Trump, in which case everything's a conspiracy,
Yeah.
and any action against him is warranted. But then the other side of it is the Trump savior syndrome, or the Elon savior syndrome, where anything they do is not subject to criticism. And it's just, I think it's the dialectic you're describing, and the nuance is what we really need. But people are easily manipulated. We're seeing it in front of our eyes. We saw it on the left, and now it's moving over to the right.
Yes, that is exactly what I'm seeing. It's kind of mind-boggling. I want to address what you were talking about with the ether, because I think this conversation is really, really interesting and has major implications for, I don't know, for a lot of things. Like what?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
I'll just add this. So I mean, I've been diving into a lot of this whole biodigital convergence stuff, and they keep talking about hacking the biofield, and of course, the biofield and was called the aura, and that was their whole, the Age of Aquarius movement, right? They called it the aura, but that's the biofield, and they keep talking about hacking the biofield and capturing it so that they can create this collective. Essentially really the noosphere, right? Like I think that's really what they're trying, like, but technologically they're trying to, I don't really think a lot of what they're saying they can do is actually possible, right? Like the soul catcher technology. But I think the narrative is very convincing, and I think they are actively working on creating what they have tried to convince us they can already do. But if there is ether, then that kind of changes how all of that works.
Yeah, it does. Because you don't hear ether discussed in these narratives, because ether is an ancient idea and it was taken out of physics after the 1887 Michelson-Morley experiment. And then Einstein came in and replaced everything. There was also another famous study in the late 1800s. It's known as Airy's failure. But again, it presupposes that Earth is moving. And if you look at the results from a different lens and take out that presupposition, which, as I mentioned before, Einstein and all the others acknowledged, we can't tell if Earth is moving around the sun or the reverse.
Right.
But we've chosen one based on the observations of the lights in the sky. The presupposition that Earth moves led scientists to conclude that that study failed to prove the ether, therefore Airy's failure. But if you talk to Robert Bennett, the PhD I mentioned in physics, he will say it's actually Airy's success. Because with a stationary Earth and what's known as an ether drift, you can explain the observations very similarly. So what would then ether be? And I've heard many different opinions on what it could be. And I do think it's compelling that this was an ancient notion that probably we've just said, oh, that's fiction, and we've taken it out. But maybe that is part of the reason that 96% of the universe is this dark matter and dark energy. And it's the reason that physicists acknowledge there's no unified theory that can reconcile the two leading theories, which are relativity and quantum mechanics. Basically, the equations, metaphorically speaking, blow up when you try to combine them. In other words, physicists have no clue what's going on, and anyone who tries to tell me, which they like to do, but Mark, we can explain things so well with the heliocentric model and the Big Bang, like we've got it pretty well figured out. No, we don't. It's grant me these miracles with 96% of the universe and no unified theory, and then we can explain everything. So I give that preface to say that we should be asking questions, and to bring back the ether actually makes a lot of sense. Also, given that we can explain these old experiments with the ether. So what is the ether? I've heard this notion. Dr. Stephen A. Young, who I mentioned, he wrote A Fool's Wisdom, the theoretical physics PhD, who's been questioning everything. The way I interpret his view on it is that it's sort of like a spiritual interface, that the ether is the background medium in which everything exists. So what we call matter is really a specific excitation of the background ether, or even light is an excitation. And from that lens, what we would call the movement of light is actually our interpretation of sequential excitation of ether. So it's like a whole reversal of how we look at everything around us, that there is some spiritual world, the ether is the interface, and then we have this apparently material world. And I'm curious, Courtney, how does that, if I'm anywhere correct about what ether is, if it's real, does that align with what you've been looking into?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And it's that's really interesting that's like what they believed at that time. How long did they believe that? Do you know?
Ether was an ancient. I mean, there were the four elements, which Dr. Stephen A. Young goes back to too. Yeah. He thinks that our physics needs to look at those elements. So that's earth, air, fire, and water. And then the fifth element, the special one. There was a movie called The Fifth Element, the ether.
Right. But I'm just wondering, like, where was that based out of? Like, was it based out of ancient Egypt? Do we know? Or
I don't know exactly, but I think as far back as people have gone, like I'm pretty sure it's that ancient of a belief.
Yeah.
I don't know the origin date though.
Yeah. I would have to look into that. That's just, because that does kind of line up with what a lot of what I've been looking into and what they believe. And I don't know. My guess is, like, quite honestly, and like this is before I've done enough of a dive into the history of it, and I'm now going to, because I'm really curious. But the way that it's being described gives the person a lot of power. So this is you can manipulate. It's kind of like the photon experiment. It's the idea of
the observer effect is what you're describing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, the observer effect. So it gives the person a lot of power.